I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner. So I thought we would start off with the first question of, well, it's not a question, but right, well, a request, right? Can you give us an overview, a summary, right, of the friendship between Arnold Schoenberg and Gustav Mahler? I mean, it's very moving, inspiring, but it's also filled with a lot of tragedy.
Right. Well, it's actually a little bit of an enigma for music scholars because biographically, I mean, there were lots of connections between the two of them. They, lived in Vienna sort of at the same time. They were part of the same circle of friends. In fact, Schoenberg and his teacher and friend and brother-in-law, Alexander von Zemlinsky, used to go and have dinner with the Mahlers. Both Gustav and Alma. And Alma talks about how, they would have conversations around the piano after dinner about musical matters. And oftentimes Schoenberg and Mahler would get into arguments. And one of them actually Schoenberg got so excited, let's say it that way, that Mahler decided to throw him out of the house. And Schoenberg left in a huff, and Mahler said to his wife, don't ask them over ever again. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, he went back to her and said, how come Schoenberg and Zemlinsky haven't come over? I missed them. So it was that kind of love-hate relationship. Schoenberg, when he talked about Mahler's music, didn't really say much about its influence. It was more, kind of like I say, a personal friendship and a personal influence. Mahler supported him financially because he had a good job as the director at the court opera, and Schoenberg was struggling, in his early years. And Mahler would also go to Schoenberg's concerts and advocate for him. I mean, there were times when, people would boo and hiss Schoenberg, and Mahler would confront them. But Schoenberg would say that, I'm not getting that much from Mahler's music. Really, my influences are Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, Wagner, and Brahms. And scholars have traced the relationship between Wagner and Brahms. Wagner from the motivic standpoint and from the chromatic harmony standpoint, and Brahms from the formal standpoint. And there's also a connection with Richard Strauss. Particularly some of Schoenberg's texted works, like Pelléas and Melisande, in particular, were very strongly influenced by Strauss and the leitmotivic tone poems. But with Mahler, it's harder to draw the connection. And I've even seen dissertations and other treatises that have talked about this. People talk about orchestration, that there's aspects of Mahler's orchestration, sort of more like chamber-like orchestration that Schoenberg picks up, particularly during his atonal period. There's also the idea that Mahler did have what I call musical idea and what Schoenberg called musical idea, which is basically a large conflict resolution narrative. I did an analysis of the opening movement of Mahler's 10th Symphony once, where I found a very clear conflict resolution narrative. So that might have been an influence. And scholars also talk about how they were using some of the same harmonic devices, chords built in fourths and things like that. So there are some connections, but it's debated.
Yeah. Well, I recall one anecdote that just really stuck in my mind that you supplied in one of your writings. When Schoenberg was having difficulty paying the rent, and I think it must have been a difficult, humiliating, perhaps even experience for Schoenberg, but to ask for 300 to 400 thaler
Yeah.
and um, Mahler responded, right, by sending, I believe it was 800, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
double the higher
Yeah.
of the two that he asked for, and that's really impressive. The difficulties that Schoenberg was having in this regard, was that primarily um, because he was still finding his way in the professional world, or was there some degree of the societal problems of anti-Semitism of the time, right? Because we know that individuals like Mahler, right, would convert to the church sometimes in order,
Hmm.
to gain posts that would otherwise not be available to them. So,
Right.
was that uh, was that reality at least partly responsible for Schoenberg's financial struggles, or is that reading too much into it?
Well, I think you could say that both of those were factors. Yeah.
All right, all right.
Part of it was that, Schoenberg was known even in his earliest years as sort of the avant-garde composer.
Mm,
And
mm,
his earliest music, Verklärte Nacht, Pelléas and Melisande,
mm,
Girl Eater, pieces like that.
mm,
I mean, they're still basically within, the tonal key system.
mm,
And actually, they're quite beautiful pieces of late 19th century music. But in that time, Vienna was fairly conservative, and critics still, thought it was a little bit too advanced.
mm,
And so part of that was, the fact that he was thought of as, the avant-garde composer even before he turned to atonality. Um,
mm, mm,
but I think his background, his Jewish background had something to do with it. And he was one of those who did convert.
mm,
Was baptized as a Lutheran in, I think, 1898. And that was part of the reason for it, was that, he felt he had more opportunities, if he weren't, seen as Jewish. And you're right that there were many others in that circle of artists that did the same thing for the same reason. Um, but there wasn't really a lot of political or racial
all right.
pressure put on him until the 1930s, and when he
Ah,
was teaching in Berlin, and the Nazis came to power, and he had
mm,
he had to leave at that point, and
all right,
go first to Amsterdam, and then eventually to the United States.
all right. Mm,
Earlier on in his career, it wasn't as much of an issue as it was later, as I understand it.
mhm, mhm. Right. Well, now I want to transition into the historical or the theoretical underpinning or overview even of this. What shall we call it? The atonal scale, the 12-note scale,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Where does Schoenberg belong in the history of that trajectory, and is there a philosophy behind it, if that's the right word? I mean, what was going on with it?
Yeah.
Why was it emerging at that particular time?
Yeah. Well, Schoenberg's position is as one of the main sort of leaders in that whole development. One of the first composers to sort of to espouse that particular atonal style. With respect to philosophy, it's kind of interesting. He never really saw that as an underlying philosophy. He saw it
All
as
right.
a musical style. Um, and he made constantly in his writing and his lectures a distinction between style and idea. And it was sort of important to him to say that really all music essentially expresses the same message, which for him, this is another question that you sort of gave to me ahead of time, but for
Mm,
him, musical idea is essentially a narrative which goes throughout the entire piece and creates a conflict, elaborates that conflict through the piece, and then eventually resolves it. And what I found in my work, and what Schoenberg used to insist on when he talked about his music, was that all music, tonal, atonal, 12 tone, expresses those same narratives. Okay,
mm,
so philosophically, he's staying in the same place, but stylistically, as a musician, he's changing. And this, of course, is part of stylistic development throughout Europe at this time, the late 19th century. Essentially, they're taking kind of the standard ways of organizing chords and the chords that they're using, and first ornamenting it, developing it, and then completely abandoning it and going in a different direction. I have my piano here so I can demonstrate a few things, and that might make it a little bit easier to kind of understand the concepts. When we talk about tonal harmony, it's basically four chords. Okay, it's we call them tonic, subdominant, dominant, and back to tonic. Mm-hmm. And if you go deep enough, and this is, of course, what Schenkerian analysis is about, you can reduce any tonal piece to some version of that four-chord progression. Okay, I mean, different tonal pieces do different things with it. They build on it in different ways. But pretty much every tonal piece, sort of grows out of that kind of progression. So in the middle to the late 19th century, what composers like Wagner and Richard Strauss and even Brahms were doing was essentially two things. One is to sort of change the repertory of chords so that they're more chromatic. The dominant, they started adding chromatic notes to it. So it became, like a raised fifth or a lowered fifth, and so that was one of the sort of the chromatic sounds that was introduced into the system. Sometimes there were other kinds of chords that were used as well. Chords in fourths are common. Okay, rather than, these more consonant triadic sounds, they were gravitating toward chords in fourths. And even chords build on the whole tone scale, which is just, step, 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 basically. Okay, so they're adding new kinds of sounds to the system. But at the same time, they're sort of reworking the chord progression so that it's not always 1, 4, 5, 1 anymore. And sometimes, other chords would take the place of 4 and 5. Sometimes they even dropped 1 and just used sort of series of chords that didn't really, organize themselves around a central chord. So that's a gradual breakdown in the system of tonality. At a certain point, several different composers, and like I said, Schoenberg was the first. He was kind of the leader in this movement. Decided we're going to use different chords completely. Okay, we'll use more dissonant kinds of chords. We won't use the same consonant triadic things. We'll use more, that kind of sound, or perhaps this kind of sound. This is another one, that's typical to them. So we'll use a more dissonant repertory of chords, and at the same time, we'll get away from those standard chord progressions, the 1, 4, 5, 1 progressions that centered themselves around a central chord. And so that sort of decentralized, made the system more decentric, but at the same time, it expanded the repertory of chords the composers used.
Yeah, I see. Please go ahead.
So that gets us into atonal music. And like I said, Schoenberg was one of the first. But one of the main points that I make about him, and this is, you probably looked at this book, the Schoenberg.
Yes. Yes.
Is that even though he's using a different style harmonically, it's not, tonal chord progressions or chords anymore. It still projects these conflict resolution narratives that were so important to him. So the idea is the same, but the style is different.
All right, that's interesting, because when I think of chromatic clashes, for instance, one of the predominant results, right, is this creation of tension, right, that begs for resolution, right? And so it's interesting that one can achieve the resolution, right, on other grounds, not just in answer to Brahms's, Richard Strauss's, right, the intensification or more frequent chromatic clashes, if we want to call them that. So it's very interesting. And the narratival language that you're using, right, the introduction of conflict and then the conflict resolution, makes me think of that scenario, right, where we have the increase of the chromatic clashes and then the resolution to them, right, which is, and there's always been, right, the tradition in music, even that did not, right, emphasize the chromatic clashes, that you always have the resolution to the drama at the end,
Yeah.
right? And so it's interesting that this, if we want to call it a philosophy, that the goal of resolution is still there in the atonal system. So
Right.
it's fascinating.
He essentially found different ways to do it. I mean, you're right, absolutely, that in tonality, that's an easy way to express that kind of narrative, because you have more dissonant chords that are seen as kind of contradicting the central note. And at the end of a tonal piece, you can resolve everything back into the central note and the central chord. And that forms a very satisfying resolution. But what Schoenberg's doing in the atonal and also the 12-tone music is he's finding different ways that maybe aren't quite as obvious, at least not at first, but they're still creating the same kinds of narratives. I mean, I could give you like one example from, this is the 12-tone book, which I brought them with me, so I may as well hold them up. So chapter 5 of this book talks about the piano piece Opus 33A. And essentially what that piece does is it starts with a series of intervals, musical intervals between notes that are symmetrical, both horizontally and vertically. If you look at the chapter, it shows that I've got the pattern right here. It shows that it's 1 half step, 5 half steps, 5 half steps, 4, 2, and 3, 6, 2, and 3, 3, 2, and 6, 3, 2, and 4, and then finally 5, 5, and 1. And even without playing the intervals, you tell that series of numbers is symmetrical two ways. It's symmetrical both forwards and backwards, so horizontally. And then the intervals at the beginning flip over the intervals at the end, or vice versa. The intervals at the end flip over the intervals at the beginning. So it's horizontally and vertically symmetrical. But that pattern goes against the order of the row. So anybody who's ever analyzed that piece, Schoenberg Opus 33A, and tried to figure out what is the row form for that, just from looking at the first two measures, struggles with it because everything's taken out of order. It's for a reason. It's to create those symmetrical intervals. And then what Schoenberg does through that piece is, of course, that's a problem. They're symmetrical intervals, but they don't fit the row order. What he does with the piece is he kind of breaks down the symmetrical pattern step by step by step in the first 14 measures. Pulls notes forward and backward in rhythm so that you don't have the symmetrical intervals anymore. And then he replaces it with a second pattern, which is symmetrical not in intervals, but in notes. So the notes are symmetrical, but the intervals aren't. But that also conflicts with the order of the row. It would have to, because a row order goes from 0 or from 1 through 12. And if you're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you can't go from 1 to 12.
Yeah. So is the asymmetry functioning like the chromatic clash in earlier times?
Yeah, the different kinds of symmetry that conflict with the row order, those function the same way as the chromatic clashes did originally. And then in the middle of the piece, he builds up his original pattern, kind of step by step by step. And then at the end, he makes a resolution. So the original symmetrical interval pattern is done in such a way that it actually preserves the order of the row, at least for part of it. So he brings the two of them together. So without, consonant and dissonant chords, you have that same narrative. You have a problem at the beginning. You have the problem being elaborated, as the symmetrical intervals are broken down. and then you have it resolved at the end of the piece as the symmetrical intervals are, synthesized or
Hmm.
brought into relationship with the row form.
No, no, it brings to mind, right, that even with chemistry and other physical processes, right, a system that has a total symmetry really gets you nowhere. There has to be some type of imbalance in a life system in order for evolution to take place and for
Right.
sparks to fly and get things going, right? Total
Yep.
harmony
Yep.
basically, right, doesn't produce anything. So it
Mhm.
sounds like this is rooted in, or at least parallel to, right, these kinds of natural um, processes, right?
Right.
It's very interesting. Um,
Well, he discovered that you could, build narratives from breaking down symmetry and then rebuilding it again and sort
mhm,
of reinterpreting in different ways. That's what that one piano piece does. Um,
mhm,
so it's perfect symmetry, but it's also sort of symmetry that undergoes a process, through
right.
the course of the piece.
Mhm,
And that's what creates the musical idea.
right. Right. And if my memory serves me, do you liken this? Do you use the terminology of musical geometry?
I have not much, but these symmetrical patterns are in a way, sort of a kind of musical geometry. Yeah,
Yeah, seemingly it's almost like abstract.
yeah,
Um, yeah, quite fascinating. So, well, anyway, that'll. Um, I think unless you want to amplify it or augment it in some way, right? But this idea of the musical idea, right? I think you've given a pretty lucid account of it. Though maybe another example you think might help the audience, especially those who probably don't have a musical background, an example of this musical idea concept.
sure. Well, the other one I was going to talk about, or was prepared to talk about, was it comes from the atonal book. It's chapter 5,
Mhm.
and essentially it has to do with different kinds of scales. And again, maybe it'll help if I play
Mhm.
some of the types of concepts I'm talking about here. Opus 19, the little piano piece, the second
Mhm.
piano piece, which is probably one of the most famous of all of them. It starts out with just the
Mhm.
G and B. There are two different kinds of scales that can include G and B. Okay, one scale is a scale that alternates thirds with half steps. So that one goes. Okay, and a different transposition of that has G and B in it. Okay, that's called the
Mhm.
hexatonic scale.
Mhm.
And then also G and B are contained in they're contained in the whole tone scale. So both
Mhm.
of those, can include that particular pair of notes. And so what Schoenberg does with that piece is he sets up a conflict between those two scales. Okay, so we have hexatonic, the thirds and half steps containing B and G at the beginning, and then whole tone contains B and G,
Mhm.
and then hexatonic contains it again, and then whole tone contains it. Um, so two of them are sort of fighting against each other for, the right to be the parent scale for G
Mhm.
and B essentially. Um,
Mhm.
Near the middle of the piece, he brings in a complication, a further elaboration, and he includes an octatonic scale, which is alternating half steps and whole steps.
Mhm.
Um, so that particular scale, which was a favorite of Stravinsky's, but
Mhm.
Schoenberg brings it in here as a conflict in the middle of the piece. And then right before the final cadence, you have a descending whole tone scale. So the listener thinks, oh, okay, whole tone must be the main collection here.
Mhm.
And then at the final cadence, it's all hexatonic. All of the chords that are presented are members of the hexatonic scale. So original conflict, hexatonic versus whole tone, that continues through the piece. Octatonic comes in to serve as a kind of a a further elaboration of the material. And then at the end, you hear whole tone, and then finally hexatonic kind of brings everything together at the final cadence. So again, problem, conflict, elaboration of the conflict, and resolution. But in this case, it's not symmetry necessarily that's creating it. It's different types of scales that kind of war against each other for the listener's attention.
Interesting. Right. Well, the musical idea takes us now into, well, I don't know if I want to say this, but is the opera Moses and Aaron, his opus magnum. At least I'm showing my bias here. It's one of my favorites by him. But I know that the Orthodox Jewish theologian Samuel Fleischhacker, in the Cambridge Companion to Jewish Philosophy, has a chapter where he compares Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron to a whole trajectory, right, in the humanities, right, at that general time, right, that had this value of silence, right, which privileged silence over speech or the word, and right, that's Hermann Hesse, his novels, the poetry of Rilke. Rilke famously talks a lot about the Unsäglichkeit, the unspeakable. That's not a good translation, but unsayability would probably be a little bit better. And Martin Buber, the early Wittgenstein and the early Heidegger. There's a whole host that Fleischhacker lists, and right in the middle he puts Schoenberg and his Moses and Aaron opera. And I was really, really touched and impressed by your work on Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron. And so, yes, well, you deserve it. You deserve the praise. It's just really some extraordinary and challenging, I have to say. I'm not a musicologist, but I am trained in music. I play several instruments, and when I was young, right, we all want to be a fireman, and I also wanted to be a symphony director, so I took some instruction in that as well. But I'm by no means a musicologist. But anyway, this work that you've done on this opera, I don't know how to describe it as other than cutting edge. It may be, I haven't read enough in the field, but I would say I've never encountered anything as profound and I think systematic as well. And I'm, of course, going to let you get into a lot of the details of your research on this, but I'll preface it with this. Keep in mind this question, right? For after we review some of your basic ideas on this opera, while I was reading your work, this was always in my mind. Did Schoenberg ever, right, or are you aware of him ever mentioning this verse in the Torah that says that the people, right, the Israelites, saw the voice, that is the voice of God, right, at Mount Sinai? And so it's sort of like brings to mind some kind of divine synesthesia, right? The dynamic and the conflict between the word and the image, which is really what he makes the opera to be about, always brings forth this question from me, right, that they saw the voice. So was he perplexed by that, or was that really not influencing this word image dichotomy, right, in the opera? And now I'll let you take over, and you can either respond to that, or you can give us an overview of your research on that opera, right? With that, you introduce it by pointing out the trying to, I forget the wording, but basically embody, materialize the abstract. So with that,
right. Well, sort of my main sort of principle behind that. And before I say this, I should say that my work is based on several scholars who came before me,
Sure.
who worked on Moses and Aaron, particularly David Lewin, who he was one of my teachers, and Michael Cherlin, who's a friend, and Christian Martin Schmidt. And all three of them talk about how Schoenberg was adapting the whole notion of Wagnerian leitmotif. And you could also say, Richard Strauss's leitmotifs, because, like I say, he was quite strongly influenced by Strauss, to 12-tone music. Okay, and so they, and I kind of followed in the same pattern, focus mostly on what are the various leitmotifs that Schoenberg uses in the opera. How does he create them from the 12-tone row? And it's what we call partitioning, which means that you divide the row into parts, basically. 4 notes here, 6 notes there, 3 notes there, that sort of thing. And those parts have various properties. Sometimes they're symmetrical. Sometimes you see the same parts coming up in different row forms. So you can transpose the row or invert the row, but the same collection of 3 or 4 notes comes back. We call that invariance. So that's another property that they can have. And they showed, and I also showed, that the properties that these different partitions have, the different leitmotifs that Schoenberg creates from the 12-tone row, represent the topic that he's trying to represent. And the most important one is the one that represents God. Okay. David Lewin calls this X plus Y. I changed its name. I call it Depths of God. And the reason I do is because it essentially is trying to reflect the idea that, God has symmetries on various levels. There's multiple levels of symmetry, both horizontal and vertical. So it's the same as that intervallic collection in Piano Piece Opus 33A. It's perfect in the sense that it's symmetrical both ways. But this collection has symmetries on top of each other, and some of them are hidden by other relationships. So what a perfect metaphor for, God in the burning bush, hidden in his complete sense to Moses. But Moses is able to see some of those perfections, some of the symmetries that are represented by the motive. So that's a conflict that, that God has depth symmetrically, in the way that Schoenberg's portrayed him. But Moses can't completely understand all of that. Okay, he can't grasp all of it. And so that goes on as the opera continues, and it branches out into other conflicts. So I made the point in the 7th chapter of the 12-tone book that's sort of what's going on in this piece. It's an incomplete musical idea. It has problem and elaboration of the problem, but there's no solution at the end. And that's probably the best way that Schoenberg could have left it, is without solution. The other conflicts that the initial conflict lead to is God's command to prophesy versus Moses' reluctance to prophesy. That's important in the first scene. Moses' conception of God versus Aaron's conception of God. And that's actually represented motivically, because Moses picks up 2 of the symmetries in the original motive, the depths of God motive. Aaron picks up 1, and they're both different. Okay, so they understand different parts of that motive, different symmetries, but neither of them can get the whole thing, which again is a perfect metaphor for Moses wants to express God with words. He thinks that's the best way to do it, but it's incomplete. It doesn't get all the facets. Aaron wants to express with music and with image, but again, that doesn't get all the facets of God. It enables Aaron to lead the people out of Egypt at the end of the opera, but that's pretty much all it's able to do. So that's another conflict. There's Aaron's desire to communicate God by image versus the people's desire to worship the image. And of course, that leads to the golden calf scene. And like I said, these are all represented by partitions. Okay, and so essentially what the opera is doing is it's creating a constant conflict and elaboration of these different conflicts, and allowing them to branch out into other conflicts through the leitmotifs that Schoenberg uses. And some, like I say, some of them are symmetrical, some are invariant. The golden calf one is invariant. And what that means is that sometimes you can't tell what row Schoenberg's using. So he'll give you a collection of 4 notes, and that collection could come from any one of 6 different tone rows. And so there's confusion, like what row is it? And that again reflects confusion that the people are having as they, as they decide they're going to make this image into something that they'll worship, rather than a representation of an image of God as Aaron would have it. And so that continues on pretty much through the whole opera until finally Aaron is able to capture some of God's symmetries, enough of them to lead the people out of Egypt. And that's the final scene, or actually the scene before the final scene, as the people are marching off the stage and Aaron is leading them. That's the music that's happening at that point, is the God's motive, with many of its symmetries, but not all of them. And Aaron is saying, the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire, these images are enabling, me to take the people out of Egypt. So these images work. They're fine. There's nothing wrong with them. And then at the end, the final scene of the second act, the final scene is the final scene of the opera proper, is just a straight first 5 notes plus last 7 notes partition, which doesn't have any symmetries. It doesn't have any invariance. It doesn't have any of the powers that the other partitions had to create relationships between notes. It's a completely powerless partition. And so it represents really well the sense that Moses at the end is powerless. He's not able to communicate God with words. He's not able to lead the people. He's sort of left alone on stage, and without being able, completely failing at his mission. And like I said in the chapter, that's one of the reasons I believe that it really does need to be a 2-act opera instead of a 3-act opera, or a 2-act opera with the 3rd act read at the end, which sometimes happens. People will read the text of the 3rd act after the first 2 acts, because that is such a convincing final cadence, sort of expressing Moses's failure. That it seems a little silly then to read the text of the 3rd act, which then puts Moses back in charge, and he's a judge at Aaron's trial, for using images, and Aaron gets the death penalty, and so on and so forth. That seems like it's tacked on. That the cadence at the end of the 2nd act is much more convincing. So that's kind of a summary of the approach that I took to it. And of course, the details are in the chapter, and what the partitions are and how they reflect symmetry and invariance and all those other things. But it's pretty amazing, how he was able to do that, to create leitmotifs that actually do the things that the characters that they represent are supposed to be doing, or have the qualities of the characters that they're supposed to represent.
Yeah, I believe it was in that chapter that you may have referred to the music is, Schoenberg through the music is attempting to embody or materialize an abstract thoughts, right? And this is where the what I refer to as the musical geometry, right? So this is sort of the abstraction or the abstract elements that he's trying to materialize, right, by means, right, of these the symmetries. Yes, and I also did appreciate what you said there, and what you detailed in the chapter. Your argument, if we can say it this way, your argument against the integral nature of this 3rd act, because right, Moses has been defeated, it seems definitively, at the end of the 2nd act, and then suddenly at the beginning of the 3rd act, he's triumphed, apparently like in some kind of war or something that has not been narrated. And so he's suddenly on the top. It makes no sense, in any way. But this brings me back to another point, right back to Schoenberg's preference for the musical idea, the resolution, but we don't have that in this work, do we?
No, no.
And would you say that's the genius of the work?
I believe so. Yeah, because it was because of what it was intended to represent. You know, there's a conflict between representing God with word and with music and image together. And, you know, essentially the conflict isn't resolved.
Mm-hmm.
Or one could say it's resolved in favor of Aaron, I suppose. But from Moses' standpoint, which
Mm-hmm.
he's the central character, I think the story is being told from his perspective. From his standpoint, it's not resolved. You know, it ends up in complete failure. And many writers have talked about how, you know, this is sort of Schoenberg seeing himself as Moses and telling his own story, which he did do in quite a bit of his music. I mean, we haven't talked about Pierrot Lunaire, for example, but that's essentially autobiographical. You know, Schoenberg's travails as a contemporary composer, as an atonal composer, the punishments that he has to deal with, and the process of going back home again to tonality. You know, that's all reflected in Pierrot Lunaire. But Moses and Aaron is, you know, he's trying to communicate eternal truth through dissonant music, and feels that he failed, you know, or trying to express the notion that he failed through this opera, which of course I don't believe he didn't fail. You know, I don't think he failed, but he's trying to sort of express that notion through this.
Well, I suppose one might phrase it dialectically, right? That he succeeded in failing. In
That's
other
right.
words, right? If you know what I'm getting at there, I was walking here on the misty, rainy, slight. It was just sprinkling the streets of the little mountain village here in Tuscany, where I live, thinking about this interview coming up and thinking about Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron. And, you know, what occurred to me was that, well, I'm sure Schoenberg didn't think of himself as doing theology, but it looks like he did a really, really intriguing job of it in Moses and Aaron, right? Yeah. And if you think of like Maimonides, which you no doubt would have been familiar with to some extent, at least, you know, like in synagogue and the 13 articles of faith, right? Maimonides' stress on what would we call it? Basically, nothing can really be compared to God, right? And there's just no way to phrase it. The only thing we can know about God is that God is not this or that, right? So the way of negation. So you can't say anything positive. All of our knowledge is just a lack of knowledge, right? For Maimonides, and I think maybe there's this influence maybe of Maimonides' philosophy behind Schoenberg, and one wouldn't have to be a professional philosopher or theologian, right, to know something. It's a really basic concept, right, in Judaism, but. So let me go back to my question. Are you aware of whether or not Schoenberg ever brought up that strange verse in the Torah when it's talking about, right, the revelation at Sinai, and it says that the Israelites saw the voice?
Right? He never mentions it.
So all right.
He never mentions it. So
it's just. Yeah, I've wondered because he sets up the dichotomy between the word and the image,
right?
And that verse in the Torah would seem to reconcile them to some degree, in as I said, through some sort of divine synesthesia, right, where you see a sound, right? But all right.
Well, but he never mentions it. But then there's that text at the end, the final scene, where Moses admits, I too have made an image, and I've always puzzled, what does that mean? And I actually kind of speculate about it in the book that, well, maybe it's the stone tablets, that he had to have a picture of God's word somehow, so that
Right.
the stone
Well,
tablets.
right. So, but right. So, if according to this verse, the words are something they see, then the words are images. Perhaps that's a clue. I don't know. I don't claim to be an expert, but it was certainly it's a very, very important and influential statement in that part of the Torah in Judaism, right? And so there's a lot of thought that goes into that. Just what in the
Mhm.
world does that mean? How can you see a voice? And so, it'd probably be surprising if Schoenberg was not aware, right, of that passage. I mean, it's in the most important part of the Torah, so I'm sure it was. So perhaps that he shed some light on this conundrum
Yeah.
that you mentioned.
It's
Yeah,
something to continue to look into, but
sure,
I
sure.
mean, what you say about Maimonides, expressing the notion that God can't be completely known. I mean, the
Mhm,
relationship between those three motives, God's motive, Aaron's motive, and Moses' motive. I mean, that I think kind of expresses it as well as a piece
mhm,
of music could do. The
mhm,
notion that
mhm,
one of them picks up some symmetries, the other one picks up other symmetries, but they can't. Neither of them can pick up all of them. So.
mhm. And Maimonides would say too that God, strictly speaking, does not speak, right? So that's just a metaphor,
Yeah.
right? And so that's really congruent with, I think, the whole program that I at least see in Moses and Aaron in Schoenberg's opera. But Jack, it's thoroughly fascinating and enlightening. You're really to be commended, and I'll add links to your books in the description of this video when I get it up, because and I recommend everyone to buy copies. It's very enlightening.
Yeah,
So
I mean, if I can do a little bit of advertising, of course,
sure, please, please.
there's these two, but I'm presently at work on the third in the series, which of course I went backwards in time.
Mhm,
So this third one will be Schoenberg's tonal music,
excellent.
and sort of talking about the birth of this notion of musical idea and how
Mhm,
he tended to gravitate toward texts that centered themselves around some kind of conflict and resolution so that he could express that, musically,
mhm,
through following the text, through expressing the text.
excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Jack.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you.
If you enjoyed the program, please consider supporting this channel with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.